David Chen never expected his life to change on a Tuesday afternoon in October. At 42 years old, he had everything most people could only dream of. His tech company had made him rich beyond his wildest imagination. We're talking about the kind of money where you don't look at price tags anymore. $180 million to be exact. But money doesn't buy you happiness, as they say. And David was starting to understand that saying more and more each day. He had been working nonstop for 15 years. Every single day was the same routine. Wake up at 5 in the morning, check emails, hit the gym in his home, then straight to the office. Most nights he wouldn't get home until after 9. Sometimes he'd fall asleep at his desk and wake up there the next morning. His big house in Marin County felt more like a hotel than a home. Sure, it was beautiful. 3 stories, 8 bedrooms, a pool that looked like something from a magazine, and a view of the San Francisco Bay that people would pay thousands just to see for a weekend. But it was empty, quiet, cold, even with the best heating money could buy. David had been married once, about 10 years ago. Lisa was her name. She was smart, funny, and beautiful. But she couldn't compete with his work schedule. "You love your company more than you love me," she had said the day she left. He tried to argue, but deep down he knew she was right. Since then, it had just been him and his work. Well, him, his work, and Rosa. Rosa Martinez had been his housekeeper for 8 years now. She was probably the only person who really knew him anymore. She'd leave him little notes sometimes, reminding him to eat lunch or telling him she'd put fresh flowers in the living room. She was like the grandmother he never had. This particular week, David was supposed to be in Singapore, a big business deal that could have made his company even bigger. The kind of deal that keeps you up at night not because you're worried, but because you're excited about all the possibilities. He had packed his bags on Sunday night, triple-checked his passport, and flew out Monday morning on his private jet. First-class treatment all the way. The meeting was supposed to last a full week. 7 days of intense negotiations with some of the smartest business people in Asia. But sometimes things don't go the way you plan them. By Wednesday morning, it was clear the deal was falling apart. The other company wanted terms that just didn't make sense. They wanted too much control, too much money, and they wanted to change everything that made David's company special in the first place. David had learned a long time ago that some deals aren't worth making, no matter how much money is involved. His gut told him to walk away, and he always trusted his gut. That's how he'd gotten this far in life. So on Wednesday afternoon, instead of sitting in another pointless meeting, David made a decision that would change everything. He called his pilot. "Hey, Tony, change of plans. We're going home." "Home, sir? But aren't the meetings supposed to go until Friday?" "They are, but I'm done here. How soon can we be ready to leave?" "Give me 2 hours to file the flight plan and prep the plane, Mr. Chen." "Perfect. See you at the airport." David packed his things, checked out of his hotel, and headed to Singapore's airport. He didn't tell anyone he was leaving early. Not his assistant, not his business partner, not even Rosa. He just wanted to get home and have a quiet few days to himself before getting back to work on Monday. The flight back to San Francisco was long but peaceful. David spent most of it staring out the window, thinking about his life. Somewhere over the Pacific Ocean, he realized he couldn't remember the last time he'd taken a real break. Not a business trip disguised as a vacation, but an actual break where he didn't check emails or take calls. Maybe this unexpected free time was exactly what he needed. The plane landed at San Francisco International Airport around noon on Wednesday. David's driver was surprised to see him but didn't ask questions. That's one thing about having money. People don't question your decisions, even when they seem strange. The drive from the airport to his house in Marin County usually took about an hour, depending on traffic. David spent the time looking out the window at the familiar sights. The Golden Gate Bridge looked especially beautiful that day, with the afternoon sun making the orange towers shine against the blue sky. As they got closer to his neighborhood, David felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Relief. Not the relief you feel when a difficult meeting is over, or when a big deal finally closes. This was different. This was the relief of just being able to go home and not have anywhere else you needed to be. His house sat at the end of a quiet street, hidden behind tall trees and a gate that opened automatically when his car approached. David had bought the place 5 years ago, mainly because it was private and peaceful. The nearest neighbor was a quarter-mile away, which meant he could have his morning coffee on the back deck without seeing or hearing anyone else. But as his car turned into the driveway, David noticed something odd. There were cars parked along the street that he didn't recognize. Not expensive cars like his neighbors usually drove, but regular cars. Old Honda here, a Toyota there, even a minivan with a bumper sticker that said, "My kid is an honor student." That was strange. His street never had this much traffic. Most of his neighbors were older, wealthy people who kept to themselves. Seeing this many cars was like seeing snow in the desert. Not impossible, but definitely not normal. David's driver pulled up to the front door and got out to open the car door for him. But David was still staring at all the unfamiliar cars. "Looks like someone's having a party." "Sir," his driver said with a smile. "Yeah, but not us," David replied, still confused. He grabbed his bags and walked toward his front door, fishing for his keys in his jacket pocket. That's when he heard it. Voices coming from inside his house. Not just one or two voices, but lots of voices. And some of them sounded like children. David stopped walking and listened more carefully. There was definitely talking coming from inside, and music, and what sounded like people moving furniture around. This was definitely not normal. He had given Rosa the week off, along with his gardener and pool cleaner. The house was supposed to be empty. David felt his heart start beating faster. Was someone robbing his house? But robbers don't usually bring kids and play music, and they definitely don't park their cars right out front where everyone can see them. He pulled out his phone and almost called the police, but something stopped him. The voices inside didn't sound threatening or dangerous. They sounded happy. David walked quietly up to his front door and put his ear against it. He could definitely hear children laughing and adults talking in both English and Spanish. Someone was definitely having some kind of party in his house, but who? And why? David put his key in the lock and turned it slowly, trying not to make any noise. The door opened just a crack and he could see into his living room. What he saw made his jaw drop. His house had been completely transformed. David stood frozen in his doorway, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. His living room looked like a completely different place. The expensive leather furniture had been pushed against the walls to make space in the center of the room. Colorful balloons were tied to every chair and table. Streamers hung from the ceiling in bright reds, blues, and yellows. A large banner stretched across one wall that read "Happy Birthday" in cheerful letters that looked like they'd been colored by children. His coffee table, which usually held only a few carefully arranged art books, was now covered with a plastic tablecloth decorated with cartoon characters he didn't recognize. But the decorations weren't the most surprising part. It was the people. There had to be at least 20 children running around his living room. Kids who looked to be about 7 or 8 years old, all laughing and playing games. Some were hanging more streamers while others were arranging paper plates and cups on the makeshift party table. Adults were scattered throughout the room, clearly parents helping with the party setup. A woman in a bright yellow dress was blowing up balloons in the corner. A man in jeans and a baseball cap was setting up what looked like a small speaker system. Another woman was arranging what appeared to be homemade cupcakes on a platter. And right in the middle of it all, directing the whole operation like a general commanding troops, was Rosa. David's housekeeper was wearing her best dress, the navy blue one she usually saved for church on Sundays. Her graying hair was pulled back neatly, and she had a huge smile on her face as she helped a small boy tape a streamer to the wall, but it was the boy that made David's chest tighten with emotion. The child couldn't have been more than 8 years old. He was small for his age, with dark hair that stuck up in the back and a gap-toothed grin that lit up his entire face. He was wearing what was clearly his best outfit: dress, pants that were a little too big for him, and a button-down shirt that had been carefully ironed. On his head sat a paper crown that someone had made for him, decorated with glitter and stickers. In his small hands he clutched a framed photograph that David couldn't quite see from the doorway. The boy was clearly the guest of honor. Every few minutes, one of the other children would run up to him and wish him happy birthday. The adults kept ruffling his hair and telling him how special he was. David had been standing in the doorway for maybe 30 seconds, but it felt like hours. His mind was racing, trying to figure out what was happening and what he should do about it. This was definitely not a break-in. This was a birthday party. But whose birthday? And how did all these people get into his house? As David watched, he saw Rosa helping the birthday boy hang up a picture he'd drawn. It was clearly a house, A big house with lots of windows and a swimming pool in the back. At the bottom, in crayon letters that were still learning how to stay between the lines, someone had written, Grandma Rosa's Castle. That's when it clicked. This little boy was Rosa's grandson. David had heard Rosa mention her grandson before, but always briefly and usually with a sad look in her eyes. She'd told him once that the boy had come to live with her after something terrible happened to his parents, but she'd never gone into details. David, being focused on work as always, had never asked for more information. Now, watching this child, who was clearly the center of Rosa's world, David felt a wave of guilt wash over him. He employed Rosa for 8 years and he barely knew anything about her family. He knew she was reliable, honest, and took better care of his house than he did. But he'd never really thought about her life outside of work. The party was in full swing now. Someone had started the music and a few of the braver children were dancing in the open space in the center of the room. The birthday boy was laughing as 2 girls from his class taught him some kind of dance move that involved a lot of spinning. David noticed that all the food looked homemade. The cupcakes weren't from some fancy bakery. They were clearly made in someone's kitchen, with colorful frosting that had been carefully applied by hand. There were sandwiches cut into fun shapes, fruit arranged on platters, and a big bowl of punch that looked like it had been mixed from packets. This wasn't an expensive party thrown by wealthy parents. This was a celebration put together by people who didn't have much money, but had something more valuable: love and community. David also noticed that everyone was speaking in a mix of English and Spanish. The adults would switch between languages mid-sentence, and the children seemed perfectly comfortable with both. It reminded him of his own childhood, when his Chinese grandmother would mix Mandarin into her English whenever she got excited. He watched Rosa bend down to help the birthday boy open a present. It was wrapped in newspaper comics, held together with tape that had clearly been used more than once. When the boy pulled away the paper, his face lit up with pure joy. Inside was a small toy car, nothing fancy or expensive, just a simple red car that probably cost less than David spent on coffee in a single morning. But the way the boy hugged that car to his chest, you would have thought it was made of gold. "Thank you, Mrs. Garcia," the boy called out to one of the mothers, and the woman beamed with pride. David realized he was witnessing something he hadn't seen in years. Genuine happiness that had nothing to do with money or success or business deals. These people were celebrating with pure hearts, and the joy in the room was so thick you could almost touch it. But then, disaster struck. One of the children, a girl with pigtails who was carrying a plate of cupcakes, tripped over someone's backpack. The plate went flying and cupcakes scattered across David's expensive Persian rug. The room went completely silent. The little girl started crying immediately, and her mother rushed over to comfort her. Rosa's face went pale as she stared at the mess on the rug that probably cost more than most people made in a month. "It's okay, mija. It's okay," the mother whispered to her daughter, but David could see the worry in her eyes. These people clearly knew they were in a wealthy person's home, and they were terrified they'd damaged something they could never afford to replace. Rosa was already on her knees, frantically trying to clean up the frosting with napkins. She was muttering to herself in Spanish, and David could tell she was panicking. That's when Rosa looked up and saw him standing in the doorway. The color drained completely from her face. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. She just stared at David like she'd seen a ghost. The napkins fell from her hands. "Mr. Chen?" she whispered, so quietly that only the people closest to her could hear. But her whisper was enough to get everyone's attention. One by one, the adults in the room turned to look at the doorway. When they saw David standing there in his expensive suit, holding his luggage, the conversation stopped. The music was still playing, but nobody was dancing anymore. The children, sensing that something was wrong but not understanding what, stopped their games and looked around at the adults with confusion. The birthday boy, still clutching his new toy car, looked from Rosa to David and back again. Even at 8 years old, he could tell that his grandmother was scared. David stood there, still holding his bags, looking at 20 pairs of eyes staring back at him. Some of the adults looked terrified, probably imagining lawsuits or police calls. Others looked defiant, ready to protect their children and their friend Rosa if necessary. Rosa slowly stood up, her hands shaking. "Mr. Chen," she said again, her voice barely above a whisper, "you're not supposed to be here. You're supposed to be in Singapore until Friday." David could see tears starting to form in her eyes. This woman who had taken care of his home and his life for 8 years was standing in his living room, surrounded by her family and friends, looking like she expected him to destroy everything. The silence stretched on for what felt like forever. Everyone was waiting to see what the millionaire would do when he found a bunch of strangers having a party in his house. Nobody, not even David himself, knew what was about to happen next. The silence in the room was so thick you could cut it with a knife. David watched as Rosa's hands trembled, and he could see her trying to figure out what to say. Her eyes were filling with tears, and she kept glancing between him and the little boy with the paper crown. Finally, Rosa took a deep breath and stepped forward. "Mr. Chen, I can explain everything," she said, her voice shaking. "Please, just let me explain." David set down his luggage and walked into the room. As he moved, the adults instinctively stepped back, creating a path for him. Some of the parents were already reaching for their children's hands, ready to leave quickly if things went badly. "I'm listening," David said quietly. Rosa wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and looked at the birthday boy, who was watching everything with wide, confused eyes. "This is Miguel," Rosa said, her voice getting stronger. "He's my grandson. Today is his 8th birthday." Miguel gave a small wave when he heard his name, still not understanding why all the adults looked so worried. "6 months ago," Rosa continued, "Miguel came to live with me. His parents. They were driving home from work one night when a drunk driver hit their car. They both died instantly." David felt his chest tighten. He looked at Miguel, who was still smiling despite the sad story being told about him. "Miguel had nowhere else to go," Rosa said. "His father was my son, and his mother's family lives far away in Mexico, so he came to live with me in my small apartment." Rosa paused and looked around the room at all the people who had come to celebrate with them. "For months, Miguel has been asking me about my work. He knows I clean houses for rich people, but he's never seen where I work. He calls this place Grandma's Castle because I told him it was the most beautiful house I'd ever seen." David glanced around his living room, trying to see it through the eyes of an 8-year-old boy. The high ceilings, the expensive furniture, the big windows with views of the bay. To a child who'd lost everything, it probably did look like a castle. "All Miguel wanted for his birthday was to see the castle where his grandmother works," Rosa continued. "He kept asking and asking. I told him it was impossible, that it wasn't my house, that I couldn't bring him here." Rosa looked down at Miguel, who was listening to every word even though he didn't understand all of it. But then Mrs. Chen from his school heard about what Miguel wanted. "She's one of his teachers, Mrs. Rodriguez." Rosa pointed to a woman in a bright yellow dress. "She said that Miguel had been so brave and strong after his parents died, and that all he talked about was wanting to see his grandma's castle." Mrs. Rodriguez stepped forward and spoke for the first time. "Miguel is one of my students," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "After his parents died, he didn't speak for almost 2 months. The other children tried to include him, but he just sat quietly at his desk, holding a picture of his parents." David's eyes went to the framed photograph Miguel was still clutching, and now he could see what it was. A picture of a young man and woman, both smiling, both looking like they loved life. Miguel's parents. But slowly Miguel started talking again. Mrs. Rodriguez continued. And the one thing that always made him smile was talking about his grandmother Rosa and the beautiful castle where she worked. He would draw pictures of it during art time. He'd tell the other kids stories about the magical place where his grandma spent her days. David looked at the walls and saw several drawings taped up that he hadn't noticed before. They were all of houses. Big houses with swimming pools and gardens and lots of windows. A child's imagination of what a castle might look like. "When I heard that all Miguel wanted for his birthday was to see this place," Mrs. Rodriguez said, "I couldn't say no. I called Rosa and asked if there was any way we could make it happen." Rosa nodded and continued the story. "I told Mrs. Rodriguez it was impossible. I couldn't bring people into your house without permission. But she kept asking, and the other parents from Miguel's class heard about it, and soon everyone wanted to help make Miguel's birthday special. David looked around the room at all the faces watching him. These weren't wealthy people. These were working parents, teachers, families who probably struggled to pay their bills every month. But they had all come together to help a little boy who had lost everything. I finally said yes, Rosa admitted, tears streaming down her face now. I knew it was wrong. I knew I could lose my job. But Mr. Chen, you don't understand. Miguel has been through so much. His parents are gone. He has nightmares every night. He barely speaks at school except when he talks about his grandma's castle. Rosa was crying harder now, but she kept talking. I thought we could come for just 1 hour. I thought we could let Miguel see the house, take a few pictures, eat some cake, and leave. I was going to clean everything perfectly. You would never have known we were here. She gestured around the room at the decorations and the people. But then Mrs. Rodriguez told the other parents, and they all wanted to help. Someone offered to bring balloons. Someone else made cupcakes. Mrs. Garcia bought party favors with her grocery money. Before I knew it, the whole second-grade class was involved. David looked at the children who were all watching him with curious eyes. They ranged in age from about 7 to 9, and they all looked like regular kids. Some were wearing their best clothes, clearly dressed up for the party. Others were in everyday play clothes, having come straight from school. Everyone used their own money, Rosa said quickly. Nobody expected you to pay for anything. We brought our own food, our own decorations, our own everything. I was going to clean it all up and put your furniture back exactly the way it was. She pointed to the Persian rug where the cupcakes had fallen. And now we've ruined your beautiful rug. And I know you're going to fire me, and I don't blame you. I shouldn't have done this. I know I shouldn't have done this. Rosa was sobbing now, and Miguel finally understood that something was very wrong. He walked over to his grandmother and put his small hand in hers. "Grandma, why are you crying?" he asked in a small voice. "Did I do something bad?" Rosa knelt down and hugged Miguel tightly. "No, mijo, you didn't do anything bad. It's my fault. I made a big mistake." David watched this scene playing out in his living room and felt something he hadn't felt in years. His chest was tight, his throat was burning, and he realized he was on the verge of crying himself. Here was a woman who had worked for him for 8 years, who had never asked for anything, who had always been reliable and honest and kind. She had risked her job, her livelihood, to give her orphaned grandson one happy birthday memory, and here was a little boy who had lost his parents, but still found joy in the simple dream of seeing his grandmother's workplace. A boy who called this house a castle, not because it was expensive, but because it was where his beloved grandmother spent her days. David looked around the room again, at the homemade decorations, the carefully prepared food, the children who had dressed up for their friend's party, the parents who had given their time and money to help a little boy smile on his birthday. These people had more heart and generosity in their fingertips than David had in his entire body. And here he was, the rich man who owned the castle, standing in his expensive suit, making everyone afraid just by existing. For the first time in years, David was ashamed of himself, not for his success or his money, but for the fact that he had lived such a small life compared to these people who had so little, but gave so much. Miguel looked up at David with curious eyes. "Are you the king of the castle?" Miguel asked innocently. The question hit David like a punch to the stomach. Out of the mouths of babes, yes, he was the king of the castle. But what kind of king was he? David knelt down so he was at eye level with Miguel. "What's your name?" David asked gently. "Miguel," the boy answered, holding up his framed photo. "These are my mom and dad. They live in heaven now." David felt his heart break completely. Everything was about to change. David stayed kneeling in front of Miguel, looking into the boy's innocent eyes. The entire room was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Rosa was still crying quietly, certain that her life was about to fall apart. The parents were ready to grab their children and run if David started yelling. But David wasn't thinking about being angry. He was thinking about being 8 years old himself. He remembered what it felt like when his own father died in a construction accident when David was 9. He remembered the confusion, the sadness, the way the world suddenly felt too big and scary. He remembered his mother working 3 jobs to keep them fed and housed, coming home exhausted every night but still managing to smile and ask about his day. Looking at Miguel, David saw himself all those years ago. A little boy trying to be brave in a world that had taken away everything safe and familiar. "Miguel," David said softly. "Happy birthday." The boy's face lit up with the biggest smile David had ever seen. "Thank you, Mr. King," Miguel said, clearly deciding that if this was the castle, then David must be the king. David couldn't help but smile back. "You know what, Miguel? Today isn't just your birthday. Today is a very special day for me, too." Miguel tilted his head with curiosity. "Why?" "Because today I learned something very important," David said, loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. "I learned that the best parties are the ones that bring people together. And I learned that my house isn't a castle unless it's filled with laughter and friends." Rosa looked up with confusion, not sure what David was trying to say. David stood up and looked around the room at all the worried faces. "Rosa," he said, "how long did you plan this party to last?" Just an hour, Mr. Chen. We were going to clean everything and leave before 3 o'clock. David checked his watch. It was only 2:30. "Well, that's not nearly long enough for a proper birthday party," David said with a smile. The room was still silent, but now it was a different kind of silence. People were starting to realize that maybe David wasn't angry after all. "Miguel," David said, turning back to the birthday boy. "What's your favorite kind of cake?" "Chocolate," Miguel said immediately, his 8-year-old priorities very clear. "And what's your favorite kind of ice cream?" "Vanilla, with sprinkles." David pulled out his phone and started dialing. "Hello, this is David Chen," he said into the phone. "I need you to deliver a large chocolate birthday cake and 5 gallons of vanilla ice cream to my house immediately." "Yes, I know it's short notice. Money is no object. I need it here in 30 minutes. The room was starting to buzz with whispers as people tried to figure out what was happening. David made another phone call. "Tony? It's David. I need you to call that catering company we used for the office party last month. I need them to send over enough food for about 30 people. Sandwiches, fruit, drinks, everything. Yes, right now. Have them put it on my account." Rosa was staring at David like he'd lost his mind. "Mr. Chen, what are you doing?" "I'm throwing a birthday party," David said simply. "Miguel, would you like to see the rest of the castle?" Miguel's eyes went wide. "There's more?" "Oh, there's so much more." "Rosa, would you and everyone else like to give Miguel the full tour?" David walked over to the sliding glass doors that led to his backyard and opened them wide. "Welcome to the outdoor part of the castle," he announced. The children crowded around the doorway and gasped when they saw David's backyard. The swimming pool sparkled in the afternoon sun, surrounded by perfectly manicured gardens. There was a gazebo with outdoor furniture, a barbecue area that looked like something from a restaurant, and a lawn that stretched out like a green carpet. "Can we go swimming?" one of the children asked excitedly. "Well," David said, "I don't think anyone brought swimming suits." "That's okay," Miguel said. "We can swim in our clothes." David laughed, actually laughed, for the first time in months. "You know what? You're absolutely right. But let me make one more phone call first." This time David called his neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, who had grandchildren who visited sometimes. "Mrs. Patterson, this is David Chen from down the street. I know this is unusual, but do you happen to have any children's swimsuits I could borrow? It's an emergency birthday party situation." 20 minutes later, Mrs. Patterson showed up at David's door with a bag full of swimsuits in various sizes, all left behind by her visiting grandchildren over the years. "I heard there was a party," she said with a smile. "Mind if I join?" Soon the backyard was filled with the sound of children laughing and splashing in the pool. The adults sat around the patio, watching their kids have the time of their lives in surroundings they never could have imagined. David found himself sitting next to Rosa, who was still looking stunned by the turn of events. "Mr. Chen," she said quietly, "I don't understand." "Why aren't you angry?" David was quiet for a moment, watching Miguel do cannonballs into the pool with the other children. "Rosa, in 8 years of working for me, have you ever asked for anything? A raise, a day off, help with anything?" "No, sir. You pay me well and you've always been fair. Have you ever brought friends to my house? Have you ever used my things for yourself? Have you ever done anything that wasn't completely honest and professional?" "No, sir, never. So in 8 years, the one time you break the rules, it's to make a little boy happy on his birthday. And not just any little boy, your grandson who just lost his parents." Rosa nodded, tears starting again. Rosa, I'm not angry. I'm ashamed. Ashamed why? David gestured around at the party that was now in full swing. Look at what you've created here. Look at how happy these children are. Look at how much love is in this backyard right now. You did this with borrowed decorations and homemade cupcakes and your own caring heart. He paused and watched Miguel teaching one of the smaller children how to float. I've lived in this house for 5 years, and it has never been filled with this much joy. I have all this space, all this money, all these resources, and I've never once thought to use them to make anyone happy. You've worked for me for 8 years, and I don't even know your grandson's name until today. Rosa looked at David with surprise. You're not just a good employee, Rosa. You're a good person, and I'm realizing that having money doesn't automatically make someone a good person. The catering truck arrived, followed shortly by a delivery van with the biggest chocolate cake David had ever seen. The cake was decorated with cartoon characters and had 8 bright candles on top. When Miguel saw the cake, he started jumping up and down with excitement. Is that really for me? He asked, water dripping from his hair. Every bit of it, David said. But first we need to sing. Soon 30 voices were singing happy birthday to Miguel while he stood dripping wet in his borrowed swimsuit. Grinning from ear to ear, when it came time to make a wish, Miguel closed his eyes tight and thought for a long moment. What did you wish for? One of his friends asked. Miguel looked around at all the people celebrating with him, then looked at David. I wished that I could come back to the castle sometime, he said honestly. David felt his heart melt completely. Miguel, he said, kneeling down again, what if I told you that you don't have to wish for that? What if I told you that you and your grandmother are welcome here anytime you want? Miguel's eyes went wide. Really? Really? In fact, what if I told you that there's a guest house on the property that's been empty for 2 years and I've been looking for the right people to live in it? Rosa gasped. Mr. Chen, you can't be serious. I've never been more serious about anything in my life, David said. And he meant it. Looking around at his backyard filled with laughing children and grateful parents, David realized something important. He had spent 15 years building a fortune and buying a castle, but he had never learned how to build a home. These people had just taught him the difference. 3 months later, David woke up to a sound he'd never heard in his house before, the sound of a child laughing in the kitchen. He walked downstairs in his robe and found Miguel sitting at the breakfast counter, eating cereal and telling Rosa about a dream he'd had where he could fly like Superman. Rosa was making coffee and smiling in a way David had never seen her smile before. Good morning, Mr. David, Miguel called out when he saw him. This had become their morning routine. Miguel would get up early and have breakfast with his grandmother before school, and David would join them for coffee before heading to work. It was such a simple thing, but it had changed David's entire life. The guest house had been empty for 2 years. David had told Rosa that day at the party. What he hadn't told her was that he'd actually been thinking about converting it into an office space where he could work from home more often. But watching Miguel's face light up when he talked about living in the castle, David knew he'd found a much better use for the space. Moving Rosa and Miguel into the guest house had been easy. Rosa had protested at first, saying it was too much, that she couldn't accept such generosity. But David had insisted, and eventually Rosa realized that this arrangement was helping David as much as it was helping them. The guest house was perfect for a grandmother and her 8-year-old grandson. It had 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, a living room with big windows that looked out over the garden, and best of all, it was close enough to the main house that Miguel could visit David whenever he wanted, and Miguel wanted to visit a lot. The boy had no fear of David's wealth or status. To Miguel, David was just his friend who happened to live in a really big house. Miguel would knock on David's door after school and ask if he wanted to see his homework, or play catch in the backyard, or help with whatever project Miguel was working on for school. David found himself looking forward to these visits more than anything else in his week. He started leaving work earlier so he could be home when Miguel got off the school bus. He began keeping art supplies and games in his house for when Miguel came over. He even had a small desk put in his home office where Miguel could do homework while David worked. But the changes in David's life went far beyond just having Rosa and Miguel living on his property. The day after Miguel's birthday party, David had called his lawyer. I want to set up a foundation, he had said, for children who have lost their parents. David had never been interested in charity work before. He'd written checks to various causes over the years, mostly for tax purposes, but he'd never been personally involved in anything. But watching Miguel and hearing his story had opened David's eyes to how many children were out there dealing with the same kind of loss. The Miguel Foundation, as David named it, started small. David donated $1 million of his own money and began working with local schools and social services to identify children who had lost parents and needed support. The foundation provided college scholarships, but it also did smaller things that made a big difference. It helped pay for school supplies, sports equipment, music lessons, summer camps, all the things that helped children feel normal and included when their world had been turned upside down. David threw himself into the foundation, work with the same intensity he'd once put into building his business. But this felt different. This felt meaningful in a way that making money never had. Within 6 months, the foundation had helped over 100 children. David started hosting events at his house, not fancy fundraising galas, but actual parties where the kids could come and just be kids. His backyard became a regular gathering place for families who had connected through the foundation. Rosa became the unofficial coordinator of these events. She had a natural ability to make everyone feel welcome and comfortable. She would cook for huge groups of people, organize games for the children, and somehow managed to remember every child's name and story. Miguel became the foundation's unofficial mascot. At 8 years old, he was wise beyond his years when it came to understanding loss, but he was also full of joy and hope in a way that inspired the other children. He would tell them about his parents, about how sad he still felt sometimes, but also about how he'd learned that sad feelings could exist right alongside happy feelings. David's business partners were amazed by the transformation they saw in him. He was still successful, still smart about deals and investments, but he was different. He smiled more. He asked about people's families. He seemed to care about things beyond just making money. "It's like you're a completely different person," his business partner had told him one day. "I'm the same person," David had replied. "I just finally figured out what I wanted to do with my life." David started taking Miguel with him sometimes when he had to travel for business. The boy loved flying on the private jet and staying in nice hotels, but what he loved most was exploring new cities with David. They would walk around downtown areas, visit museums, try local restaurants. David saw the world through Miguel's eyes, and everything seemed more interesting and beautiful. On one of these trips, Miguel had asked David a question that stopped him in his tracks. "Mr. David, do you think my mom and dad would be proud of me?" They were sitting in a hotel restaurant in Chicago, sharing a plate of French fries and looking out the window at the busy street below. "Miguel," David had said, "I think your parents would be incredibly proud of you. You're kind, you're smart, you're brave, and you make everyone around you happier just by being yourself." Miguel had nodded seriously, then asked, "Do you think they would like you?" David had laughed. "I hope so. I would have liked to meet them." "I think they would like you a lot," Miguel had said with the confidence that only an 8-year-old can have. "They always told me that the best people are the ones who help other people. And you help lots of people now." That conversation had happened 6 months ago, and David still thought about it almost every day. A year after that first birthday party, David threw Miguel another party at the house. But this time it wasn't a surprise. This time it was planned weeks in advance, with invitations sent to all of Miguel's friends from school and all the families from the foundation. Over 100 people came to Miguel's 9th birthday party. There were children who had been helped by the foundation, teachers from Miguel's school, neighbors from the community, and even some of David's business associates who had become involved in the foundation work. The party lasted all day. There were games in the backyard, swimming in the pool, a magician who came to perform, and enough food to feed a small army. David hired photographers to capture every moment, and by the end of the day, he had hundreds of pictures of children laughing, families connecting, and pure joy filling every corner of his property. But the best moment of the day came when Miguel stood up to make a speech. "I want to thank everyone for coming to my party," Miguel said, his voice small but clear as he spoke into the microphone David had set up. "Last year I was sad because my mom and dad died, and I thought I would never be happy again." The crowd was completely quiet, listening to this 9-year-old boy speak with wisdom that amazed everyone. "But then I got to see my grandma's castle, and I met Mr. David, And I learned that even when bad things happen, good things can happen too. My mom and dad are still in heaven, and I still miss them every day, but now I have a new family too. Miguel looked over at David, who was standing at the edge of the crowd with tears in his eyes. Mr. David taught me that families aren't just the people you're born with. Families are the people who love you and take care of you and want you to be happy. So thank you, Mr. David, for being my family. The crowd erupted in applause, but David barely heard it. He was too busy trying not to cry in front of 100 people. Later that evening, after all the guests had gone home and the cleanup was done, David found himself sitting by the pool with Rosa and Miguel. Miguel was exhausted from the excitement of the day and was leaning against David's shoulder, half asleep. "Mr. Chen," Rosa said quietly, "I need to tell you something." David looked at her with concern. "What is it?" "Before Miguel came to live with me, before his parents died, I was thinking about retiring. I'm getting older and the work was getting harder. I had saved a little money and I thought maybe it was time to rest." David nodded, not sure where she was going with this. "But now," Rosa continued, "I can't imagine being anywhere else. Taking care of you and Miguel, helping with the foundation, being part of this family we've created. This is the happiest I've ever been in my life." She paused and looked at Miguel, who was now completely asleep against David's shoulder. "That little boy saved my life just as much as you saved his. He gave me a reason to keep going when I thought I was too tired to keep going. And you gave both of us a home when we needed one most." David carefully adjusted Miguel so the boy would be more comfortable, then looked at Rosa. "You know what's funny?" David said. "I thought I was successful before I met you and Miguel. I had money, I had a business, I had this big house, but I wasn't happy. I wasn't even really living." He gestured around at his backyard where just hours before it had been filled with laughter and celebration. "This is what success really looks like. Not the money or the house or the business deals, this. Family, community, purpose, joy. You and Miguel didn't just come into my life. You taught me how to live my life." Miguel stirred in his sleep and mumbled something about chocolate cake, making both David and Rosa smile. "Come on," David said softly. "Let's get this birthday boy to bed." As they walked toward the guest house carrying a sleeping Miguel between them, David realized that a year ago he had thought he owned a castle. But he'd been wrong. A year ago he'd owned a house, now finally he had a home.